to Tea with Tolkien, an online community for the Hobbit at heart. We are inspired by the works, life, and Catholic faith of J.R.R. Tolkien and strive to encourage others towards a deeper love and understanding of Tolkien's legendarium by hosting a free book club, providing free resources, and by cultivating a vibrant and positive community online. Our book club is currently wrapping up our discussion of The Fall of Númenor, edited by Brian Sibley. If you would like to join in on future discussions, you can sign up for our free book club at teawithtolkien.com/book-club to receive the link to our Discord server. For the sake of this book club, I've broken The Fall of Númenor down into 10 sections. And so we are going to be covering the 7th section today. Part 7, The Shadow Falls on Númenor. This is going to be covering pages 146 through 172, which covers the years 1800 through 3255. Circa year 1800. From about this time onward, the Númenorians begin to establish dominions on the coasts. Sauron extends his power eastwards. The shadow falls on Númenor. Tolkien writes that the Númenorians had tasted power in Middle-earth, and this is something that they weren't going to give up. From this point on, they made permanent settlements along the coasts of Middle-earth. Their yearning for immortality also increased along the years. Tolkien writes, and the more joyful was their life, the more they began to long for the immortality of the Eldar. In 1869, Tar Kiriatan becomes the 12th king of Númenor. In the time of the 11th king, Tolkien writes that the first sign of the shadow was about to fall upon them, and this was when Kiriatan, son of the king, was restless of heart, and he forced his father to yield the scepter before he was willing. Kiriatan also oppressed the men of Middle-earth by demanding tribute from them. In 2029, Tar Atanamir becomes the 13th king of Númenor. He was the first king who spoke openly against the ban of the Valar, claiming that the life of the Eldar was his by right. The Númenorians murmured amongst themselves concerning the ban and their mortality, and the Eldar reported these sentiments to the Valar, so basically they were snitching on them. Manwë sent messengers to the king who advised them regarding their fate, saying that Eru alone could change the doom of the world. The messengers said things like, "Yet it seems that you desire now to have the good of both kindreds, to sail to Valinor when you will, and to return when you please to your homes. That cannot be, nor can the Valar take away the gifts of Ilúvatar." They also said, "Thus you escape and leave the world and are not bound to it, in hope or in weariness. Which of us, therefore, should envy the other?" This entire dialogue is really interesting, and I think it sheds a lot of light on Tolkien's concept of death as a gift of Ilúvatar. The king and his men responded that they envied the deathless because a blind trust was required of them and that they didn't want to be parted from the earth. The messengers replied something that I think is really interesting and wanted to highlight, saying, "The love of Arda was set in your hearts by Ilúvatar, and he does not plant to no purpose." So you see it really emphasized here that their love of Arda is good. It's good. It was given to them. It's set in their hearts by Ilúvatar, and it's not meant to be something that's causing them harm. Rather, it's meant to be something that's good. So you see as this love becomes twisted and their desire to remain in Arda becomes darkened by the shadow, that's when things start to get kind of rough for the Númenorians. Ultimately, Atanamir did not heed this counsel, and he was the first of the Númenorian kings to cling to his life and the scepter until he was witless. Thus he is called the Unwilling. Now getting back to Sauron, Tolkien writes, "In this age, as is elsewhere told, Sauron arose again in Middle-earth and grew, and turned back to the evil in which he was nurtured by Morgoth, becoming mighty in his service." Sauron hated and feared the Númenorians, and his plots against them slowly began to take shape. In 2251, we have the death of Tar Atanamir. Tar Ankaliman takes the scepter, and rebellion and division of the Númenorians begins. About this time as well, the Nazgul, or Ringwraiths, slaves of the Nine Rings, first appear. So 2251, Tar Ankaliman becomes the 14th king of Númenor. Under the reign of Tar Ankaliman, the people of Númenor became divided into two factions. They were called the Kingsmen and the Elf Friends. The Elf Friends were also called the Elendili, or the Faithful. The bliss of Númenor was diminished in this time, but they hadn't yet fallen wholly into the shadow. Tolkien writes, "For the kings and their people had not yet abandoned wisdom, and if they loved the Valar no longer, at least they still feared them." So you can kind of see them on the edge of something very bad, but they're not quite there yet. In this time, the Númenorians became obsessed with recalling or prolonging life, but they only ever achieved the ability to preserve dead bodies. They also developed a belief that there was a land of shades filled with the wraiths of the things that they had known and loved upon the mortal earth, and that in shadow the dead should come there bearing with them the shadows of their possessions. The Númenorians became even more restless as time passes on, desiring pleasure and wealth more than ever. The usage of the elven tongues was abandoned by most, although it was still used in an official capacity out of fear of what it might bring. In this time, Sauron had reclaimed the Rings of Power and distributed them to the peoples of Middle-earth, giving 7 to the dwarves and 9 to men. The rings were used to govern the hearts of their bearers. The dwarves proved more difficult to corrupt, and they mainly used the rings to gather wealth. Ultimately, most of the dwarven rings were consumed by dragons, but Sauron did recover some. The men who received the 9, however, became mighty but miserable. Tolkien writes that they had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unendurable to them. The 9 men who had these rings became the thralls of Sauron, entering into the realm of shadows and becoming invisible to all except Sauron himself. These men were called the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, or the Yulairi. 3 of these men were from Númenor, but other than that, we aren't given a ton of information about their identities. In 2280, Umbar is made into a great fortress of Númenor. In 2350, Pelargir is built. It becomes the chief haven of the faithful Númenorians. So while the Númenorians are making their first settlements in Middle-earth and persecuting the men of Middle-earth, the elf friends, or the faithful, settled more northwest, where their primary home was Pelargir. In this time, Sauron was busy extending his dominion eastward, and he was seeking specifically to bring about the downfall of Númenor because he hated the Númenorians so much. He decided to give himself the title, the Lord of the Earth. And in this time, his dominion grew very fierce, and many elves fled from Middle-earth. To the people of Middle-earth, Sauron was seen as both a king and a god. After this, in the fall of Númenor, we're given a couple of events and dates just right in a row, so we can go through those right now. In 2386, Tar Telemaite becomes the 15th king of Númenor. In 2526, Tar Venimelde, a queen, becomes the 16th ruler of Númenor. In 2637, Tar Andukal usurps the throne after his wife's death, denying the scepter to his son. In 2657, Tar Alcarin becomes the 17th king of Númenor, and he rules for 8 years after his father's usurpation is completed. In 2737, Tar Kalmakil, or Arbazelagar, becomes the 18th king of Númenor, and in this time the name of the king was first spoken in Adunaic. In 2825, Tar Ardaman, or Ar-Abatarik, becomes the 19th king of Númenor, the last to use a Quenya royal name. In 2899, Ar-Adunakor takes the scepter, becoming the 20th king of Númenor. In this time, the lives of the kings waned, but they hardened their hearts all the same. He was the first king to take his royal name in the Númenorian tongue only, and Ar-Adunakor means the Lord of the West. Tolkien writes that this name seemed ill-omened to the faithful, for hitherto they had given that title only to one of the Valar, or to the Elder King himself. The usage of the Elven tongue was banned, though still taught by the faithful in secret, and the faithful were persecuted, and the Eldar ceased to visit Númenor. In 2962, Arzimrathon, or Tar Hostamir, becomes the 21st king of Númenor. 3033, Ar-Sakalthor, Tar Falasian, becomes the 22nd king of Númenor. 3102, Ar-Gimmelzor, or Tar Telemnar, becomes the 23rd king of Númenor. I'm terribly sorry if I got the pronunciation wrong in any of those. That was kind of a lot, but I think I did all right. maybe this is a good spot to mention if you do notice anything amiss in these videos, please let me know in the comments so I can correct it. So Ar-Gimmelzor was considered the greatest enemy of the faithful thus far. In his days, the White Tree was unattended, the Elven tongues were forbidden, and the Eldar were banned from Númenor, and the Hallow of Eru was neglected. Tolkien writes, he revered nothing and went never to the Hallow of Eru. The chief dwelling of the faithful in this time was Romena, and the lords of Andúnië were of the highest in honor after the house of the kings. Gimmelzor was wed to Inzilabeth of the house of the Andúnië, who was in secret one of the faithful. They had 2 sons, Inzilladun, who took after his mother, and Gimmelkad, who took after his father. Now the laws required the scepter to pass to their eldest, Inzilladun, against his father's wishes. In 3175, Inzilladun became known as Tar Palantir, the 24th king of Númenor, and civil war broke out. Palantir returned to the tradition of taking his kingly name in Elvish, and he repented and sought to return to the friendship of the Eldar and the Valar. He returned his visits to the Meneltarma, and he tended to the White Tree, but ultimately this was all done too late, because Tolkien writes, but his repentance was too late to appease the anger of the Valar with the insolence of his fathers, of which the greater part of his people did not repent. Now Gimmelkad, his brother, led the king's men in his opposition. And after his death, his son Pharazôn continued to lead the men in the opposition of the king. Pharazôn was the nephew of the king, and a man of great stature and influence. And the daughter of Tar Palantir was named Zimraphel, or Miriel in the Elven tongue. Tar Palantir died, and the scepter should have been passed directly to Miriel, but Pharazôn married her against her will and claimed the scepter for himself, calling himself Ar-Pharazôn, or Tar Kalion in the Elven tongue, and Miriel was called Ar-Zimraphel. This occurred in the year 3255. Pharazôn was the proudest of all kings of Númenor, calling himself Pharazôn the Golden and desiring the kingship of the entire world. In this time, the leader of the elf friends was named Amandil, of the Lord of the Andúnië, and he spoke out against Pharazôn. Because of this, the faithful were persecuted, and the lords of the Andúnië were stripped of their titles and wealth. Amandil was then commanded to live in Romena. In the end of this section, Tolkien brings us back to the Waldman letter, where he speaks about the downfall of Númenor, saying that it was a second fall of man which brings about the reshaping of the earth. He says it is the result of an inner weakness of men and Sauron's exploitation of that weakness, writing, reward on earth is more dangerous than punishment, and saying its central theme is, inevitably, I think, in a story of men, a ban or prohibition. He also says their reward is their undoing, or the means of their temptation. And then he ends this section by outlining the 3 phases of the fall of Númenor. We started out with acquiescence, or obedience, that is free and willing. Then, unwilling obedience. So we see when the Númenorians are fearing the Valar without loving them. And then third is ultimately rebellion. So that wraps us up for this section. I really enjoyed our book club discussion, and I know we are a bit behind in getting these videos out, so it might not be fresh in anyone's mind anymore, but we spoke a little bit about how this section is more of an outline, because I think we got a little bit spoiled by the tales of Aldarion and Erendis because of how much dialogue and close-up storytelling we got. Rather, this section is more like an outline or a history lesson. It's possible that Tolkien could have added more to this later or simply ran out of time, but in comparison, it felt a little bit more bare bones, but I really did appreciate how there is still a ton of detail in this section. That wraps us up for this week. I will be back next week with part 8, where we are going to get towards the final days of Númenor. Thank you so much for listening. If you're listening to this in podcast form or watching, if you're watching this on YouTube, I really appreciate all of your support. If you would like to learn more about the Tea with Tolkien community, you can always visit us at teawithtolkien.com.